did you have anybody help you with it?
Well,
or did you
I
put
wrote
together?
it, and then I had somebody edit it and show me where I needed some rewriting and improvement.
But the overall tenor.
I fundamentally wrote it with help and the editing side.
Well, I congratulate you. It's really an interesting book. It's an interesting life.
Well, thank you. Yes, so far. Just getting started.
Welcome. Welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Mr. Maurice Strong. And Mr. Maurice Strong has a resume that we would have to take the whole hour reading, because he's had such an illustrious and important career that we'll be talking about during the program. But I do want to show right at the outset a book that's published by Texaria, just out now. And let's show it here to the audience of the way it would look in the bookstores. It's got a really interesting title, Where on Earth Are We Going? And it's written by Maurice Strong, and it recounts a lifetime of concern with the human condition, and with particular concern with ecology and so forth. But Maurice Strong, it's an honor to welcome you to Conversations and to Manhattan Network.
Well, this is the kind of conversation I enjoy and appreciate.
All right. Well, it's very interesting. As we said, you've had such an interesting background. You're now currently involved as a special advisor at a senior level with Mr. Kofi Annan, and the book has a foreword by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations. You've been very involved with that. But I wonder if we can, because your book does recount a very interesting life right from the beginning when you were very young. But maybe you could share just a little bit of your own background, and then fill us in a little bit on some of your business and diplomatic concerns, and then particularly with your concerns with matters of the ecological condition as we begin to think ahead. Could you share just a little bit of your own background, please?
Yes, indeed. As you say, I have had a very active life and a lot of privileges, I have to say. And so I've had a lot of experience, but I have very little expertise in any one field. I wouldn't consider myself the best of businessmen. I wouldn't consider myself the best of diplomats. I'm an amateur in almost everything I've done in the environmental field. However, I was a product of a interesting, I think, and very creative, formative childhood in a small town in rural Manitoba during the Depression. And I recall those early Depression years because they were tough years. And maybe tough years aren't, in retrospect, so bad for a young fellow.
So they toughen you up a little bit, or give a different edge, or understand things?
Well, at the time, you know, I thought this was normal. I mean, we lived in a house in 40-degree weather in the wintertime, no internal toilet facilities.
40 degrees below.
Yes, no water, no heat.
Yes, indeed.
Just you had every morning you had to get up and bring in wood and light a wood fire to heat things up. And so, you know, and I was the oldest in the family, and I had to do that.
You could relate to Nanook.
I certainly could. In fact, at a very early stage of my life, I lived in the Arctic.
You did indeed. That's wonderful. And you were playing like you were a goose or something, and the Aleut people or something, they just laughed and had Inuit people. They had a great,
Well, you know, I landed there on a supply ship.
As a young man.
Yes, when I was 16 years old. And of course, the ship could only remain a very short time, and no real docking facilities. You had to unload with little boats. And therefore, they put me right to work, making sure that the Inuit people did not go back to their homes at high tide. So I had to entertain them to keep them there, and I stumbled upon this. I didn't know the language at that point. I did learn it eventually. And so I found out that one of the things I did was make like a duck. There were a lot of these eider ducks around, and I emulated them, and that did engage their attention. And so I was able to keep them there until the next tide came in, and they all went back to work unloading the ship.
Innovation takes many forms.
Well, it stayed with me, that name.
All right,
in fact, last summer, I went back up to Chesterfield Inlet, where and some of them still remembered me, not as Maurice Strong, but as Meetik.
Meetik, what's that?
Meetik is the boy that makes like a duck.
I see. Is it really?
That's right.
Isn't that something?
That's right. So that name stuck in their memory. But
and you went off venturing when you were very young. Went off on ships, and you were really adventuring, looking into this sort of thing.
Well, remember, this was not only the end of the Depression was accompanied by the opening up of World War II. And of course, I was, because I had a very enlightened school teacher, he allowed me to move through the system more rapidly than most. I skipped, I think it was 4 grades in school. And of course, that meant that in the last year of high school, which was the university entrance level, most of those in the class were well, they're all much older than I was, and the boys were going off to war. You know, they were 17, 18, 19 years old, and I said, you know, why should age alone prevent me from going off?
Right.
If I can keep up with them in school, why can't I go off? So I'm not proud of this, but I have to explain that I actually changed my birth certificate to add several years to my age, and then went off into the Merchant Marine.
Yeah, and you went off to Alaska, I think, and then
you
wrote a letter home, and then they came and met you off the boat when you came back from Alaska.
You've obviously read my book.
Oh, it's hard to put down. It's really well written.
Well,
it's an interesting story. Yeah.
So, you know, this was, this isn't because I didn't like my home. I had a good home, wonderful parents. My father, of course, lost his job in the Depression, and that really made me think: why do people need things, and yet the system won't put the needs together with the fact that they're willing to go to work?
We were chatting that you had an acquaintanceship with Mortimer Adler, who had written with Lewis Kelso the book, the Capitalist Manifesto, and that Lewis had been impressed because he was in Colorado, and the people would come off the trains were loaded with people, trains were empty, and the people were riding, and it was an absolute puzzlement of how this could be, a system could be allowed to be.
Well, I was a great fan, of course, a friend as well as a fan of Mortimer Adler, who joined him in writing that book, The Capitalist Manifesto. But I, of course, didn't know the answers, but I thought there was something wrong with a system.
I think a lot of people of goodwill did at that time, right?
Well, you know, Canada is a country rich in resources.
Absolutely.
And
the planet is, in a certain sense.
Yes, it is. And yet people not being able to work, wanting things, needing things, being willing to work to produce things, and simply the system wouldn't put those two things together.
Don't want to get too astray, but we have every night we watch the McNeil Lehrer Hour, or the Lehrer News Hour now, and you got David Brinkley advertising, as it were, for Archer Daniel Midland, the big agribusiness company, and they say, no problem with food, we can create an overabundance of food for everyone, it's just the politics and economics. I guess that's a kind of big but you know, that kind of a, that's a theme or a conundrum that confronts the consciousness of a great number of people concerned now.
Well, you know, I have been involved in agriculture myself.
Have,
I had the privilege to chair the review of international agricultural research 2 years ago, which was, of course, led by the World Bank and supported by many others. You know, production today is not the problem, and yet hunger and malnourishment exist on a great scale, and particularly in developing countries, but even in some of our countries. And why is that? It isn't because of the lack of food. It's the fact that poor people cannot access the food. They do not have the means.
The buying power.
That's right.
The demand side.
That's right. Rich people don't die of starvation.
That's right. That's right.
But
there was a time in history when the overall equation was such that there was not enough.
Oh, yes.
And when we were on the Serengeti Plain a couple hundred or 1,000 years ago, it was a condition of scarcity. But something's happened through the intervention, the technological, and the progress, in a certain sense, that's altering things in a fundamental kind of way. Is that a theme that might be true in trying for us to understand the context of which ecology and other matters are going to be considered?
Well, there's no question. What has happened as the human population has grown, and as we have become more and more knowledgeable about our condition, about how we can benefit from the bounty that nature has given us, how we can manipulate natural resources.
Genome now.
Yes, how we can create more wealth. This, of course, has improved our economic well-being. It has also enabled us to, at least for the time being, to produce more food than the world really needs at the moment. That doesn't mean we solved the problem, though, because the problems are really economic, political, and social. That people still are not able to access the bounty of the earth. Our civilization has produced wealth, and now it has the capacity to produce wealth.
Almost unlimited?
The problem is that in the process of creating the richest civilization ever, we have widened the gap between the poor and the rich. The lion's share of the benefits of this tremendous capacity we have to create wealth has gone to a very small portion of the population. And yes, it has helped a number of poor, but still the overall number of poor in the world is greater than ever. And at the same time, the gap between those who are poor and those who are rich, has grown immensely.
Immense, yeah, it is. It's your Kofi Annan, Secretary General, points out that I think it's half the population of the world, we're at 6 billion now, lives on an income less than $2 a day.
That's
and
right.
There's a great number, perhaps a billion and a half, that live on $1 a day.
That's right. Well, live
half the population's never made a telephone call.
That's true.
Kofi Annan will tell us. Yeah.
That's right.
We ought to keep these things in mind, I guess. Yeah.
We must keep them in mind.
Yes.
And the fact that the people live in faraway lands does not mean that their fate does not concern us. It's not only for humanitarian and charitable reasons that we have to be interested in them. We have
most practical, yeah.
Yes, because fundamentally, in the kind of global civilization we live in today, no country can insulate itself from what some of the things that are happening in other countries. I mean, for instance, diseases cross boundaries. Pollution crosses boundaries.
Absolutely.
The same CO2 emissions that go into the atmosphere in China or in
United
Chicago,
States, yes,
go into the same atmosphere and affect the climate
melt
change.
The same ice caps at the polar
everybody.
areas, yes.
So no longer can it, the old, what was it, Dunn who said, no man is an island?
Yeah.
Well, also no nation today is an island.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to have a degree of cooperation beyond anything we have ever yet experienced.
And if there's anything out of the historical context that presents, in a certain sense, with all the problems, and there are problems in any situation that has practical reality involved and so forth, but the institutional structure of the United Nations after the Second World War that was established is a major institution that people of goodwill or understanding really have to do the best that they can in order to give assistance and support to the institutional structure that this institution provides from the historical context, and you've been very involved in that, and are.
Well, I have a privilege. That is a great privilege for me, and my role has been minor, but it has been a long role. And
I don't think it's that minor, sir, if I may say.
Thank
You've had a major role.
Well, thank you. But, you know, the UN is often criticized, and of course, as one who has worked in the UN for many years, I'm totally mindful of its many weaknesses and deficiencies. But they derive primarily from the fact that the UN was created by governments and kept weak by governments. It was given a broad mandate to become a vehicle through which governments, and now others to an increasing degree, can cooperate in dealing with major world issues which none of them can deal with or deal with as well alone. So it is not, it's often confused that the UN is a government. It is not a government.
Yeah, right.
It is an instrument of the governments. It's the national governments that actually own it, that finance it, that give it its mandate, that tell it what to do and give it the means to do that. The trouble is governments tell the UN to do things which they do not provide the resources that make it possible for them to do it effectively.
Yeah, and some people hold back paying their dues and so forth, as has been not too recently has been seen in the case of the United States.
That's true. And that, of course, the United States was the originator of the UN.
Yeah. Out of an era of great optimism that was felt. We had Eleanor Roosevelt, and we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
That's right.
Was forged.
That's right.
And with great difficulty on her part. Major documents that we should have credence to, or give credence to, and so forth. And it was there, but there are difficulties that have arisen from it. It's not possible to think in terms of the establishment of the UN. We had the establishment of a couple hundred years before of the United States. We had a confederate, the Articles of Confederation, and we had to go to a federate. What is the appropriate pattern for us to think in terms of this question of the sovereignty is vested at the national level? We live in a world of increased permeability, as Zbigniew Brzezinski will say, between the nations of the world and so forth. What's the future of governance of this world in terms of the relationship between sovereign states, particularly as we look at breakaway subnational groups that might begin to assert their own sovereign entity, and the need for the collective whole to be able to have an overall, like, federal kind of relationship to one another and that sort of thing. Is that that's a large question that confronts us collectively?
Well, it is it's more of a challenge than a question, because more and more issues today cannot be dealt with effectively by a single nation, even the superpower, the United States. Of course, these global issues can't be dealt with very well without the United States either, and that's why people have reacted with such concern to some of the recent decisions of President George W. Bush in respect to
Kyoto.
Yes, but the fact is that if I'm a great believer in the fact that every thing that is done in respect of government should be done at the level closest to the people concerned.
Okay. As
but
a general
that means
principle.
it has to be effective. Now that's what we call the principle of subsidiarity.
Yes, right.
But that even on that basis, the number of issues today that can only be dealt with at the global level, or at least in a global context, providing the context and the international agreements and frameworks and institutional structures that permit national action to take place effectively. So it isn't a matter that everything has to be done globally, but much of it, I mean, for example, again, the control of the airwaves, control of air transport, control of disease, obviously global environmental issues like climate change. So there's a whole host of issues that simply can't be dealt with by any one nation, and the United Nations provides the indispensable instrumentality through which the governments can come together to work cooperatively on these issues.
And it's really a precious thing. It really is a precious thing that people of goodwill, I mean, we'll want to talk a little bit about some of the people who contribute. Ted Turner has contributed recently in a major kind of way toward supporting the UN in the face of a great deal of nationalistic or short-sighted criticism that is directed at it. And it's a favorite whipping boy of a certain number of people of political power in the world, isn't it?
It is, and I have to give immense credit to Ted Turner. I've been very familiar with what Ted has done in his industry, of course, as a great industry pioneer and leader. But at the same time, his sense of social responsibility, his vision, his understanding that, for instance, in the nuclear age, the Cold War had to end. Now he's concentrating on trying to convince governments to rid the world of nuclear weapons.
He's working with Sam Nunn on that initiative.
And then the $1 billion he put into the United Nations Foundation to support UN projects and programs. And then more recently, the $38 million that he put in
with Mr. Holbrooke
personally to enable the U.S. to get agreement with the other members of the UN to United Nations to reduce the UN
from 25 to 22%.
U.S. fees from, exactly. Now that came out of his own pocket. So Ted is not only generous, but he's generous in an intelligent way. And of course he has some eccentricities that people criticize. But in my view, that just makes him a more interesting person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You know, I mean, well, that's a thing. There is he's one of those who has supported it, and there should be more. And he could, you recount in the book that he just was going to have a meeting with Mr. Kofi Annan. He came up on the plane without any thought. He hadn't given any thought to the idea that somebody of his stature, who had done very well in the AO merger and so forth, he came into the headquarters ready to have a meeting with Mr. Annan, and he said, "I've decided I want to give $1 billion to the UN, which is a huge gesture."
Well,
and he gave that to you, and you had to get the news to Mr. Annan. But I mean, the idea hadn't occurred to you, but the idea is one that he could be an inspiration to others who would join in behind that impetus to try and give some support to this very credible institution. It is incredibly important institution. No?
No, and actually the meeting was set up for other purposes.
Yes, right.
And so when he came in to see me, just as a pre-meeting before he went in to see Secretary General Annan,
with all that energy.
Yes. Then he told me that, and I asked him. I said, "Did you say $1 billion?"
Billion with a B?
Yes. Yes. He said, "I just figured out that coming up on the plane." He said, "I figured out that the value of my stock's gone up about $1 billion since the first year, and before I get too used to it, I'm going to commit it to the United Nations." Well, you know how many people would do that?
Yeah, I know, it's amazing.
No one else has done.
Yeah, at a crucial time. time, in a certain sense, when it could have been. Remember, the League went the way it did, didn't it? Right. You know, and we have to keep that in mind. Yeah. And it's a good way. Maybe we can segue or back to the story of your life, because you've been involved in business. Yes. In Canada. You've been in the power, a great deal of business across the board, kind of thing. After this very adventuresome youth that you had and so forth, imitating a duck up on Hudson Valley, up in Hudson Bay. But you did that, and then you also early on involved in the UN, and you've been involved with the UN, and certainly we want to just say, without losing track of it, that you were the main organizer, or the organizer of the incredibly important Rio Summit on matters of ecology and seeing the world in ecological terms in 1992. So you've got an ecological portfolio that is recognized around the world, but some of those things. But you've been very involved with the UN throughout a good deal of your life, even from when you were a young man at a low level, but always involved.
Well, that's right. I came here and as a teenager, and I stretched my age a bit. I'm not really proud of that, but I sometimes have to explain that. And I served in a temporary role with the UN at Lake Success, actually, in Flushing Meadows in the old days before the headquarters was established here. It just really consolidated and confirmed my deep interest. But I also realized that I didn't have a university education. Yeah. I didn't have any political or financial connections. And so I decided, I wrote in my diary that this is what I want to do, but I've got to go back to my own country, which is Canada, and do something with my life, and then maybe I can come back to the United Nations. Well, I had a lot of good luck, and I kept that ambition in focus, and eventually I did come back when U Thant invited me to come back in at the level of an Undersecretary General.
All right. You've had a number of portfolios at the level of Undersecretary General, which you carry now, for the reform, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, I've never made it my career in this. It has been my central interest, but I have always kept a certain degree of independence, because sometimes it's better to do things. I won't recommend that to everybody, but for me it has been good to go back into the private sector and then come in again when there's a job to be done that you think you can do.
Right,
so
like
I've actually,
it's actually
I've come in.
Well, super consultant.
Well, I've been an advisor, but in lots of cases, like for instance, in the environment program, I was actually the executive head of the United Nations Environment Program, and the Secretary General of the conference in Stockholm in 1972, which actually gave rise to the creation of UNEP. So I've had both advisory and executive.
The creation of what? I'm sorry.
No, gave rise to the creation of the United Nations Environment Program.
I see, right,
The conference in Stockholm in 1972.
Which you were involved with.
So all I'm really saying is I had different roles, some of them of an executive nature and some of them of an advisory nature.
Yes, I see. You were a businessman, you were doing, that's a certain kind of, and then the interest in ecology, where there are some businessmen who do not take an interest in ecology. I mean, that they're just interested in the bottom line, and they're interested in that, and they don't take that larger view. When did you pick up, if I may, with the responsibility of running businesses successfully in a realistic way and everything, the notion of ecology? Or is it something that's been there all along, or what do you think? Because you're recognized as one of the very most important people on this planet in terms of keeping us all abreast of the importance, or aware of the importance of an ecological outlook or a comprehensive outlook. But when did you pick up on that?
I didn't study something called ecology.
Well, I know.
But I did study nature. I was fascinated in my early days by nature. And even though I was lucky enough to be able to move through my formal schooling relatively well, I used to get bored, and I'd go out into nature and stay days out there and watch the cycles of nature. And this is, nature is a whole combination of systems.
Yes, it is.
Of, how plant life interacts with animal life, how weather patterns affect both human and animal life. I was fascinated with the rhythms of nature. Well, ecology is just systems. It's really a matter of how different forms of life on our planet relate to each other and relate, of course, to human beings. I didn't call it ecology. I'm not sure I even knew the name at the time, but I was fascinated with the systematic rhythms of nature. And that was at the root of, I guess, my interest. And at the same time, of course, I was looking at the social side of economic side of society and wondering why nature worked so well and human society seemed to be so deficient at that stage. So, you know, I didn't know the word ecology. I didn't know the word environment, at least in its present sense.
Right.
But over time, I realized that some of the ideas and experiences that I had, some of the interests I had labels attached to them, like ecology and environment.
Yes, yeah. Marshall McLuhan used to use the term, he was at Toronto or Ontario, he used the term ecologically, that it echoes logically. I did geography, I studied with Carl Sawyer, I think, who helped bring the word ecology into the lexicon of the modern age and so forth. But it's an overview, and it's, as you say, it's a systems understanding. Right. So it begins to move. You said you were friends with Mortimer Adler, and you knew Buckminster Fuller, the giant. They were comprehensivists. They were looking at things in a very large systems way rather than a reductionist specialist kind of way, which has been the mark of a lot of academia. And that's something that's in that ecology does hold the thing. The Vedic or the Hindus have been telling us for a long time there are no academic disciplines in reality. It's all a seamless web. And to get that overview of the whole thing in a systems way is part of the mark of responsible, if that's right, leadership understanding or intellectual or otherwise, isn't it not?
That's right. Well, what impresses me as I began to not only look at nature but read on, and study of what really made up this Earth, one realizes that actually the conditions that make life on Earth as we know it possible have only existed on our planet for a very minute portion of our geologic history. They are not the natural condition of the Earth. Is not to support a human type of life. Right. It's only been in very recent times in geological terms that the conditions have been auspicious for human life. Right. And we look out into the cosmos, we see vast numbers of planets and solar systems and galaxies, but we see no sign of any other that is hospitable to life. So what we can deduce from that is that if a human form of life on Earth is not unique in the universe, and mathematically at least I don't think it is, it is at least very rare. And even on our planet, the conditions that make it possible have only existed for a short time, and we, human beings, in our generation now, are impacting on those conditions. We are literally changing the conditions on which the life and well-being depends. And it follows from that, surely, that if our future depends on the way in which we manage our impacts on the life support systems and environment, then we've got to start to do a better job of doing that management. And that's why I look at it systemically. It's like your body. You know, doctors can tell you how to remove a wart or to remove the infection from a sore or so, but they understand that this is a product of a system.
That's right.
You know, and the infection is not just something that occurs. It's something that's a product of some systemic imbalance in your whole body.
Right. I mean that's really interesting. You say that. And it's just the genome is just given. They've just given us the genome now. We understand. I mean, it was only, I don't know, a couple of decades ago. You're talking about compressed time or something. Things that we've been around 200,000 years, maybe 100,000 years. We come out of a common gene pool in Africa, Homo sapiens sapien. We're living for that time, 10,000 generations perhaps, something. And we get now down to where the knowledge base that's beginning to become available to us. We didn't have electricity when my father was born. I mean, it's just coming down so quickly now in the knowledge base. And one of the things of the genome is we got apparently a human organism has 100. It's hard to imagine. 100 trillion cells makes up a human organism, and they have the DNA, which creates that whole organism, a communication system of semi-permeable cells that are together as a system in a healthy organism. And there's a communication that goes on between. It's an amazing metaphor that we're beginning to have the intellectual understanding of what's going on that we've had to intuit it in the historical condition.
No question of that. And, you know, that's why the analogy between the Earth's life systems and individuals is quite an interesting and useful one.
The Gaia
because,
thing.
you know, it only takes a small thing to intervene in your bodily system to create a sickness that can bring you the whole system down.
AIDS.
And it's the same with the environment. You know, that's why, you know, you can put too much CO2 in the atmosphere in the United States and it's going to affect the climate of the whole world.
Absolutely.
And it literally, when China starts doing the same thing, as they will, that's going to affect the United States. So we live on a planet now which we realize is a single system.
Yes, well,
complex, yes, but a single.
We do realize it, yeah.
Now, but the way we manage it is not system. It's broken into a whole series of little nation states that don't correspond to the way in which the system, life systems of the Earth are organized. Now, that doesn't mean we can't manage it. We'd have to abolish nation states, but it does mean that nation states have got to work together to create a management and a policy system that will permit us to ensure that our impacts are going to lead to survival and to a better life.
To survival, and maybe even to fulfilling some sort of a purpose. There's a big question that they would talk about since probably Cro-Magnon days, if there's some purpose to it. Bucky Fuller used to say that we had a purpose of moving across entropy, or systems to move toward entropy, to the limits of the system, and that biological evolution was moving across entropy and bringing increased conscious pattern of understanding the process of which we're a part. And we were moving across the tendency to move toward chaos, and that we may have some purpose in that. But we're coming into that, and you said the nation state. The biological analogy is, again, that every one of the cells in our bodies are not, they're semi-permeable. I mean, they have to have a flow between the cell walls of a system. They have to be relating to that. It's not autarkic. Each cell can't be autarkic. If it is, it becomes a cancer. So autarky, or some sort of a thing at the national or subnational, that are problems of possible other countries breaking away in some sort of an ethnic identity thing to establish a nation, or the subcategories within those various nations of business and other kinds of organization, is not something that is, there needs to be some sort of a vision of the whole system, or comprehensive vision, and it isn't encouraged in our academic tradition. There aren't systems of of overall systems thinking for the young and so forth. It's all becoming reductionist, specialist, maybe because of economic views of how things are to be organized or something,
And compartmentalized. I mean, literally, most of our governments and business and other institutions are organized around specific disciplines and purposes. And they all make an important contribution on the whole, but very few of them are managed with a view of their effect on the rest of the system. We're realizing more and more that we have to do that, but we simply have not devised the means by which we can do it. The United Nations gives you a framework for doing this on an international level, but it needs significantly greater support. It needs to be frankly reformed. Kofi Annan has done more to reform the United Nations than any other single Secretary General.
And you've helped him in that, have you not? At a level of undersecretary responsibility?
Yes, I did have the privilege of helping him to do that. But what has to be recognized is that there's a limit to what the Secretary General can do.
Yes, indeed.
He's the Chief Executive Officer, and he has certain powers. And what's interesting is he presented his reform program along two tracks. One were the things that he as Secretary General could do, had the power to do. The other were things, and this is most of the fundamental changes in the UN, that only governments can do, and he could only recommend. In the first category, virtually everything in that category has actually been done. Now, you might argue that it isn't finished yet, but it's been at least started and a long way towards implementation. Not a single thing of the fundamental changes he's recommended to governments have yet been acted on. So again, that illustrates the fact that the UN is really a product of the decisions of the governments that control it and run it. And we in the Secretariat, including the Secretary General, of course, they have an opportunity to present the views to governments. But fundamentally, this is an organization that's created by and controlled by its shareholders, and its shareholders are the nations of the world, the nation states. But you mentioned something a minute ago that is quite germane to my own thinking, and that is the fact we have knowledge now. See, just take the environmental field, for example. Before the Stockholm Conference in 1972, much of what we were doing to the environment was somewhat inadvertent. We were going along with our economic growth, and these side effects, air and water pollution and impacts on the oceans and on marine life and then the atmosphere. These were things that occurred as byproducts that we didn't really understand, and we began to understand them. And at Stockholm, I like to believe that's where we lost our innocence. That's where we began to realize that what we were doing to ourselves and that we needed to change the way we were managing our economies.
Interesting.
Now then, we had the Brundtland Commission, where Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway, and I had the privilege of being on that. And it really made the case for sustainable development as the only viable pathway to a sustainable future for our planet. And based on that, the United Nations General Assembly then took a decision to hold the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah, 20 years out.
That's right. And now, and in that period, we learned an awful lot.
Sure did.
Not only about what our problems were, but how to solve them.
Yeah.
And yet, still, as we approach next year the 30th anniversary of Stockholm and the 10th anniversary of Rio, we now know so much about what's ailing us, the Earth. We know so much about what to do. We know so much about how to do it, and yet we're only not doing it, at least not on the scale necessary. Now, why is it? I'm convinced it's because, implementation depends on motivation. And we do not have the level of motivation that permits us to do things. So it's no longer lack of knowledge. It's no longer lack of capability. It is lack of motivation. Now, what are our motivations? Two basic categories. One is economic self-interest. That's at the, and there, a study the Earth Council did recently indicated that in 4 sectors alone, energy, agriculture, transport, and
communication?
Water.
Water. Oh, yeah, water.
The nations of the world were spending more than $700 billion a year subsidizing practices that ran counter to the environment, wasting people's money, and at the same time undermining the Earth. And that
700 billion.
Billion.
With the B.
Yes, billion. Now that makes it clear that dealing with environmental problems isn't a matter of just pumping a little extra money in here and there. It's a matter of changing our priorities, changing the way in which we make our decisions. As the business leaders at Rio said, changing course. Changing the way our industrial civilization sets its priorities. Now, why aren't we doing that? In my view, there's a deep moral and ethical dimension here. That people respond to their self-interest, yes, but they also respond to their deepest moral, ethical, and spiritual values. And that's why at Rio I presented a proposal to world leaders that they adopt a kind of Magna Carta for the Earth, an Earth Charter.
Agenda 21?
Well, that was the practical agenda for implementing it. No, I proposed that they adopt an Earth Charter, a statement of moral and ethical principles to guide the conduct of people and nations towards the Earth and towards each other. They weren't ready for it at that point. We went partway in that direction. So Mikhail Gorbachev and I joined together and brought a lot of other people together. Stephen Rockefeller, just one of the guiding lights in this and in the drafting process of producing a People's Earth Charter. And now millions of people around the world have signed on to this. And now, as we
it came into final form. I mean,
yes, it is. It is,
and it is called.
It is called the Earth Charter.
Okay, the Earth Charter.
Yes, and it's on the internet, on the website. But the important thing is that government leaders weren't prepared for it in Rio. So people took it up.
Right, okay.
And now it's going to be presented to governments next year in Johannesburg to world leaders. But it will then have behind it the support and commitment of literally millions of people, particularly young people around the world.
That are signing on to this.
That's right. It's not
Where do we find it? Where do we find it?
Well, you can. I've got one in my bag here.
Oh, I might take that with me. But I mean, as far as can you go on the net and find it?
Yes, you can. Yes.
And it's generally.
Oh yes, it's Earth. It's the Earth Charter, and the Earth Council is one of it provides the secretariat for the Earth Charter movement.
This is a major document people should be signing on to and being aware of. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a major document that sets out universal principles, and this Earth Charter sets out universal principles that incorporate things?
Absolutely. Principles that can be embraced by people of all faiths. Common principles which permit people to have a shared value system from which to proceed to practical cooperation.
Right, right. And then it has certain understandings of the operation of the system of which we're a part and that sort of thing, the common understanding of that, which can be a... Eleanor Roosevelt had difficulty when they had the communists of Russia wanting to see a certain view of human rights as opposed to the capitalists of North America, and it was difficult bringing those together. If you're trying to bring together commonality of understanding, universal commonality between various people, political or otherwise, in this planet, you will have people that will say economic development is important, the environment is not, or something. You have these things. What are the principles that you find that are able to be bridgeable of the political differences in the way in which human beings see the operation of the system? That, you know, what principles can they agree on in your experience, and what are some of them that give difficulty in trying to reach at that or other practical applications of how the world can change in an appropriate direction?
Well, sometimes the difficulties are in the nuances.
All right.
Fundamentals, there are a number of fundamentals embraced in or promulgated in the Earth Charter, which people everywhere more or less agree on. That is respect for life itself.
All right. Yeah, that's a good beginning principle, isn't
it? And all life, and the recognition that human life is part of the whole fabric of life.
Yes, right.
And yet we, because of we have evolved to the status where we control so much power now that what we do affects all of life, and therefore we have a high and special sense of responsibility.
Absolutely.
Responsibility to the life system of the Earth, responsibility to each other, because what we do individually affects other people. And also respect for the various cultural and traditions and spiritual and moral traditions of other people.
And it was written in that sense, yeah. Now, what about, if I may, what about if you take a practical application, and maybe it's not the right order to, but let's suppose somebody we're planetary, we have a globalization process going on now. We have businesses locating overseas, getting away from high labor costs to low labor costs, high economic environmental standards to low environmental standards. And they say, I want to go to this place where I can have low labor and take advantage of that. I can see bottom line considerations, and I don't want to hear about the troublesome problem about putting pollutants in the water. I can do it over here, and we can race down to the bottom there. And that's one of the things that we have to deal with in a practical sense, is it not? Well, and is it the business decisions that are being made in terms of the next quarterly report responsibility to the shareholders as opposed to some comprehensive responsibility? Or what's the
Well, you know, of course, we have an imperfect world.
Yeah,
fortunately, we have some examples of very, very responsible business behavior. We also have some bad examples of where people, poor people, are exploited, and where nature is exploited. For instance, people, you know, some of the sweatshops that people talk about, you know, from which we buy products, you know, really do not meet social and humanitarian.
And yet we buy the products.
Yeah.
And people will say that it's better that they have that so that they can get a leg up toward getting to what we had to go through. And William Blake said we had the satanic mills and we had to live through that, and the way that other people will have to go through the same kind of thing. And this is a problem that confronts us, is it not?
Yeah, but the good side of it is people are becoming more aware of it. People like you are raising this issue. And to the extent that people as consumers begin to realize that they're subsidizing bad practices, labor practices, environmental practices, they actually change their buying habits. Not yet on the scale necessary, but there's encouraging signs that people, once they understand what's happening, most people are good people. Most people want to do the right thing, and if they can understand what the right thing is, if they can actually appreciate the consequences of their action, and it's more feasible to do this. The age of communication means that when a product is being produced under conditions that are really not acceptable,
they were pretty
people
bad.
Know about it.
Yeah, they were pretty bad in Dickensian England, you know,
at
the time of satanic mills, and it was terrible and so what. They had to go through that. Are the people of the world that are in what you call the developing world going to have to go through that same kind of exploitation, which it was in the time of Blake and so forth, and we just have to accept that they're going to be exploited, or do we set standards that can jump the pace a little bit faster, set standards? Is it possible for International Labor Organization to set up some sort of universalist standards of labor justice or something? You can't set prices, the market has to go its own way, and also at an environmental level. These are questions that confront us. What kind of international standards can we set? Because
well, actually, we are doing that.
All right, sir.
The International Labor Organization, which is, of course, very interesting because it includes not only governments but business and union representatives. But it has a whole series of international agreements that actually establish agreed labor standards and standards for operating in various industrial conditions. And so these do exist. They're not always adhered to. They're not always enforced.
Again, it's hard. You don't have the executive authority to, or the authority to enforce it.
But one of the good things about the global information revolution is that people are more and more aware of these bad. It's very much harder to hide these practices. It's you know, television and media and non-governmental organizations.
International Labor Committee, or that
they
group,
all
Kernighan and those people are making it available to the sweatshop conditions, as they call them, around the world. But then the people who are operating those sweatshops take umbrage because they say, these people are making $2 a day. If we weren't here, they wouldn't be making 50 cents a day, and we're going to, you know, do you understand what I'm saying?
Of course,
it's on the New York Times today, the front cover.
No, that's right. But you see, the very fact it is on the front cover.
Right.
You know,
that's right.
You know,
and it's been in your reports prior.
As I say, we have an imperfect world. Our job is to make it a better world. Now, if we say it's got to be a perfect world before we'll do anything about these problems, they'll never get resolved. Part of what globalization is all about is globalization is creating wealth, as we indicated earlier, at an unprecedented rate. But globalization is also revealing a whole series of inequities and imbalances in our current system, which will simply not be tolerable over time. The kind of conditions you were describing have been tolerable for years because people they've either had to accept them or they didn't appreciate what was going on. Now, as I say, we're losing our innocence. We do
Maybe
know.
Good,
Yes, and it's going to take time. Good things don't happen instantly, and they don't happen just by condemning bad practices. They have to happen by helping to institute good practices, good policies, good institutional structures.
Good practices, good understanding within the paradigm of our thinking in terms of which we've inherited from the history, or being able to set up some sort of perhaps an understanding within an alternative pattern. Bucky Fuller used to talk about how with ephemeralization, doing more with less. We had the computer revolution. We don't have to put. The Club of Rome report came with Malthusian views of things that the growth of satanic mills was necessary. The industrialization was necessary to rape the planet in order to get the industrial development. But now with the computer revolution, the chip doing more and more with less and less, it may be possible to bring the have-nots up without bringing the haves down, nor completely raping the pattern of the natural pattern of the world. Do we maybe at a time where those kind of things are possible? And that's a new paradigm vision that makes possible things that can't be seen within those who are in the old paradigm? Or
yes, I think people are moving from what you call the old paradigm to the new paradigm. What is the new paradigm? We call it sustainable development.
Sustainable development.
Yeah, that's really economic development that is carried out in a manner that creates a positive synthesis between the economic, the social, and the environmental dimensions of development. Yes, and therefore, it isn't a goal in itself. It's a pathway.
Yes.
It's a means to a sustainable, secure, and equitable future for humankind. All these conditions we're talking about will only be dealt with through through a process by which we try to create the policy structure that supports people in their struggle for a better life, that doesn't give them this Hobson's choice of a $1-a-day job or nothing, under a $1-a-day job under
many
terrible
people are submitted to that, not only within the not only within the developing, but even within the developed
That's
world.
right.
The Marxists used to talk about wage slavery. I mean, and people are constrained by that. And also the technology is increasingly responsible for production in a ratio with labor, and most income is distributed by labor. Very few people have any ownership of the non-labor aspects of production. Is that a problem at a theoretical, economic level?
Of course.
And the kind of thing that Mortimer Adler was addressing in the Capitalist Manifesto may be relevant now in a way that it was hard for people to pick up on back in the 50s?
Yeah, I think a lot of his ideas are...
or
Kelso's idea, they joined together in that, that landmark book, The Capitalist Manifesto. Had a lot of good ideas. I think they would probably write it slightly differently in the context of day, but the fundamentals are very still just as germane and useful. But, you know, we're not going to create a perfect world. We're not going to have and need a world government. We do need a world system, though, in which justice and participation by people in decisions that affect their lives is the norm, not the exception. And that it will become just so integrated into our culture, into our institutions, into our way of doing business with each other, that we'll have a global civilization in which diversity can flourish, because each of the sectors of society, valuing their own culture and their own values, at the same time respect those of others. And
it's like the cells of a body. I mean, you got liver cells, you got all these different kinds. There's great diversity in that, but it comes together as a system.
Well, you see, we have two things. We have the earth, that is the natural creation of the Creator, and we have the world, which is what we are doing to the earth. Now, we've got to have a world that conforms to the realities of the earth.
Yes, right.
And it's a fantastic challenge. Now, when you think of it, it's an awesome challenge for our generation to realize that we are the first generation ever of which it is literally true that we are masters of our fate, that the future of humankind will depend on what we do or fail to do, and I believe in that direction will be set in the first 3 decades of this new century.
First 3 decades?
Because human population and the scale and intensity of human activities have now reached a stage where we are literally affecting the conditions that I mentioned earlier.
That's what we study in geography. Man's role in changing the face of the earth.
And therefore, and of course, we can't say man. There's another half of our humankind.
Goes
well, I shouldn't be correcting you.
No, it's quite all right.
We have to realize that we've got some partners in this.
Absolutely. Not to mention the rest of the biologicals.
That is very true. So I think it's an immense challenge, because I do feel that the direction of life as we know it, civilization we know, will be set in our times by what we do or fail to do. And I don't believe we have taken on yet the implications of the awesome responsibility we have, that we are literally now in control of our own future. We can build a better life. Knowledge and technology opens up the prospects that every person on this planet can enjoy a better life. That is now feasible. It never has been really feasible.
In a way that it never has been in the past.
At the same time, the same processes, mismanaged, carelessly managed, or managed without a strong moral and ethical base, can destroy and will destroy or undermine life as we know it on this planet.
Yeah, right to an incredible degree. Joshua Lederberg says we could destroy the species.
Absolutely.
First time we couldn't do that.
No, we are.
In my grandmother's time, my mother's time. Now we can.
So that's why it's in that context.
It's like a pregnancy coming whole term or something.
And that's why, you know, when I look at the United States, and I love the United States, I respect the United States, but I also realize the immense responsibility of the United States. And why we look at a new president who's a good person as a person, but some of the early signals he's given about how he's handling the awesome responsibilities he's now acquired are very disturbing. For example, stepping away from the Kyoto Protocol, stepping away from the process by which the United States has been joining in a very painstaking process of trying to negotiate means of solving these problems, because the U.S. can't solve them alone. The world can't solve them without the U.S., and the U.S. is the biggest source of these. And so I hope now he has President Bush has indicated he's got some other ideas. He's working on a review, and we will hope that as a result of that review, he'll come up with some constructive ideas that are actually improvements on Kyoto, not just further dilution of the agreements that are already in the works, and that he will do it not unilaterally, because you have to work with your partners in this. You've got to actually bring the others into the process. The U.S. can't just go off on its own.
I wonder, we have all sorts of institutions. As we said, 200,000 years perhaps it's been, 10,000 generations that we've been here on this planet as a species. We've had a number of institutions that have been built up, the nation state, the corporate structure, the United Nations, other kinds of things. Now, you spoke before about the fact that there are people that are responsible for the administration of something that exists, an institution that exists, or a context that exists. But it might be that the intellectual challenge of understanding that whole system, it's difficult for people that are in a position of responsibility for a historically inherited institution that may be transformed within a systems understanding or subsumed within a larger systems understanding to carry that responsibility. It might be the role of the intellectuals or intellectual leadership or something like that. Bucky Fuller used to have he was a grand figure. And he had a large comprehensive vision, but he wasn't tied into any particular institution. Do you think it's, and maybe the understanding of that large, huge philosophical challenge that you were presenting might be more the responsibility of some of the intellectual community that would give influence and perhaps not necessarily power to understanding of these large challenges that, or what? Or would it be people that are, is there a conflict between people of responsibility for major institutions, large institutions, that might have a little bit difficult time seeing something new that's coming along because they're caught into a pattern of thinking in historical context? Or is that a problem? Where will the vision come from if there's vision that we don't have that is still needed, and where do we look for it?
Well, vision comes from people, from exceptional people like Bucky Fuller, of course, and Lady Barbara Ward Jackson.
Barbara Ward, who were some of those people? They're worth giving.
Einstein, I mean.
Einstein. There might be worth ticking off some of those and passing that on to the upcoming generation to pick up inspiration from.
But there's a lot of names. But rather than name all those names, I've given a few examples. I want to make the point that visions and ideas and even ideals are rooted in individuals. Exceptional individuals lead the way in science and knowledge and education and politics and in culture and morality. But ultimately, for society to integrate these perceptions and visions into a structure that is functioning for the whole society, they have to be embedded in our institutions.
To give practical expression.
So they start with individuals. They have to depend continuously on the nourishment and support and participation of individual people, but they have to also be embedded in our institutions. So it's a
mixed bag.
Well, it is, and it starts with the individuals. It depends on the individuals. The instigators of change are individuals, and the objects of change are individuals.
Well, I would want to say, again, we're running right out of time. It's been a great pleasure. But I would think if there's any people, one individual that we might well think about as somebody who's, in a very real sense, filled the role of making a wide connection or networking with a wide collection of the leading intellectual responsible people with a sense of ecological concern and so forth on this planet, and then also bringing that wide connection to the people responsible for major responsible and relevant institutional structures. It's been yourself, sir. And if I may say, I'd like to thank you very, very much for all your work. And I really do welcome you very much to the program. I want to congratulate not only for coming, thank you for coming in for the program, but to congratulate you on an incredibly important life that you've done and the contributions you've made to improving the human condition in the way we've been talking about.
Well, I'm grateful. I wish I could deserve that. I'll continue to work at it.
No, you do it more. You do it more.
Let me just say one thing. I've never done anything in my life alone.
All right.
except make my mistakes. So that I do alone.
Well,
Yes.
Let's quickly let the people know again about the book. It's Where on Earth Are We Going by Maurice Strong, a major force, and it's well recommended by this program and by everyone to get in touch with this book and with the life story of Maurice Strong and the directions in which he's encouraging us all to think and to move. Again, once again, we thank you for viewing. We invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for now, Mr. Strong. Once again, thank you very much for coming in. Well, and until next time.
Very grateful. And it's one of the best interviews because, you know, you obviously know what you're talking about.
No, you do, sir. You really have. I was serious with that thing. It's hard to do, but
when
you've made contact.